It is now labelled, bold as you like, the William Cobbett. Now, that gave me quite a turn, I can tell you. And as I temporarily lost my famous self-control and my self-composure, and as I looked at it, I remembered suddenly that I was summoned to address a meeting. Farmers, I thought. But you being no farmers.
Mr. Cobbett, you're welcome.
Thank you, sir.
May I introduce you to another journalist who would like to share the evening with you? This is Mr. Owen Jones.
Hi, by the way.
A journalist, a journalist, eh? I don't remember you sending anything to my register. Who'd you write for?
A similar newspaper, actually. It's the, well, no, it's not The Guardian, isn't it? I've never been upstaged by a man who's been dead for 150 years. This is humiliating, by the way. Yeah, the Manchester Guardian. It would have been about the time, I think. Yeah.
But not that loathsome, poisonous Times, I hope. No. My tuppenny trash reached 70,000. Did you know that?
I didn't know. That's a fair whack, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a lot of people.
Mr. Cobbett, would you like to return to your seat? We want, Mr. Cobbett, this evening to hear you tell us about some of the issues that you raised in your political register and in your writings, issues, for example, around the poor laws. And you wrote a great deal about the poor laws and poverty in your political register.
Poverty.
And at one stage, you were referred to as the poor man's friend.
Poverty. I must have written more about poverty than any man alive. Or dead. I managed to save a few scraps from my register. If I can find it here somewhere. Yes, here it is. Something I wrote in my register 6 months after Trafalgar. I wrote, "We must, too, remember the state of the poor. Upwards of 6 millions a year are now raised upon the parishes to be dealt out in aid of those means by which the labourer obtains his bread. And of persons receiving this aid, there are upwards of 1 million. All the labourers having families are now paupers. This is a new state of things which has been produced by the funding and the taxing system, pushed to an extreme. Let us not be answered by the observations that there must be poor, that there always have been and there always will be in every state of the country and every society in the world. We know that there must be poor. We know that there must be some very poor. We know that some must be maintained, or at least assisted, either by the parish or by voluntary alms. But is there anyone who will deny that this is a new and most deplorable state of things, which has rendered all the labourers having families paupers?"
Yep.
Elsewhere.
Come on.
Elsewhere, I wrote of the terrible consequences of poverty, and I would be interested in my young friend's views on a couple of things I wrote. To be poor and independent is very nearly an impossibility. And what, in his age, does he say to a thought that still troubles me greatly? Poverty leads to the most evil consequences. Want, horrid want, is the great parent of crime.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Cobbett. I think that Mr. Jones might well have some comments on that.
Well, firstly, wow, what an honour to be back in the People's Republic of Farnham. Thank you. Last time when I came, actually, it wasn't the 19th century. It was for, as you say, any questions. And I was worried at the time that I was going to turn up and be hung, drawn and quartered as a raging lefty. But in the end, the audience were a bit too left-wing almost. I had to kind of calm them down. So you obviously have a bit of a radical tradition here, which, of course, Mr. Cobbett over there exemplifies. And you are looking very well, by the way, for a man of your age. You have the same youthful curse and blessing I do. I look about 12, but you But you do not look 250 years old, is what I'm trying to say. So well done on that. But this is a great honour, by the way. And thank you for hugely for the invite. It's a unique format. I don't normally speak to dead people, although some of the people I've argued with, it's been touch and go. His eloquence, I think. I mean, what's disturbing, by the way, I'm going to talk about poverty. That it's frightening when you hear somebody from the 19th century. On the issue of poverty, who is more enlightened than many of the people today writing on poverty in much of the mainstream media. So you are a depressing indictment, Mr. Cobbett, of our modern media, where you have more humanity and understanding of social problems from somebody long dead than we do written in our own newspaper, not mentioning any names in the Daily Mail. Now, what I was going to say, so we're going to talk about poverty. Now, poverty... What I find interesting is because when you talk about poverty, you'll often get, for example, look at the conditions of Britons in the time of the 19th century when the likes of William Cobbett were around, and look at the huge increase and improvement in people's standard of living. And I'll often talk about poverty on air against right-wing pundits who are far less enlightened than the dead man over... He's not literally dead, so I should just stop this as macabre. And they will say, what about people in Ethiopia? That's genuine poverty. It's insulting to poverty to talk about people in this country as such. And, you know, that's a dangerous line, a dangerous route to head down when poverty has to mean starvation to qualify. Of course, in the 19th century, you could say you think it's bad now. What about the 14th century when people were dying en masse because of the Black Death? So I think what we do is we judge a society which is now, I was going to say, the 5th richest economy on earth, but since Theresa May's speech, we've actually fallen to the 6th richest economy on earth. And we judge our country by that standard. How is wealth and power, how is it distributed? And when you have a situation, one of the richest countries that has ever existed, where people live in circumstances where their lives are all too often defined by insecurity and by hardship, the inability to realise their full potential. Now, that is an indictment of the way our society is run. Now, the reason I say it's interesting talking about the attitudes of the 19th century, because, of course, in the 1830s, you had the Great Reform Bill. And what that did is enfranchise a 5th of the population. So it enabled certain, again, relatively privileged sections of society, but a far bigger franchise than existed before. But it was regarded as a great betrayal that people who had struggled, and everything we have in this country, all our rights and freedoms were won, of course, by our ancestors. So you had the likes, you know, in 1819 of Peterloo, the massacre there when women and men and children gathered to demand change, and they were massacred, some of them, of course, by the forces of the state. And what you had at the same time in the 1830s, alongside the Reform Bill, and the reason it was such a great betrayal, were the Poor Laws and the changes in the nature of the Poor Laws. And what that basically meant was relief for those in poverty so long as they worked in what became, of course, the poorhouses. And these were terrible conditions, a terrible situation for people, and unless they worked there in the most awful, unbearable conditions, then they would be deprived of any relief whatsoever. History repeats itself. It's a tragedy which opposed it, but they were almost, you'd read them, and kind of has echoes of columns in the Daily Mail writing about social security today. I mean, there was one who said that, you know, one part of the unemployed were lazy, another part were so beyond help they should be exterminated, and then there was a third who might be, you know, could be salvaged in some way. And of course, famously, we had that distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. Now, in the aftermath of 1945 in particular, there was a recognition that poverty was a social problem. And by that, what we mean is a collective failing. It was to do with the way society was organised. It wasn't something you could reduce to people's individual personality defects. So because it was seen as a collective problem, the obvious answer was you need collective solutions. That only by us collectively organising together and using the power of the state could these collective failings be remedied. And of course, that was the whole basis for the welfare state. Now, what we had from the late 70s onwards was a backlash to that, a counter-revolution, where what were once seen as social problems, like poverty and unemployment, again became, above all else, defined by people's individual behaviour. That if you were poor or unemployed, then you yourself had to take personal responsibility for that. So as unemployment massively increased, of course, in the early 80s, as Britain experienced the most rapid form of deindustrialisation at that time that any peacetime developed country had experienced in such a short space of time. Norman Tebbit, famously, of course, the right-hand man, or one of them, of Margaret Thatcher, he took to the podium of a Conservative Party conference and said in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, when his dad was out of work, then he got on his bike and he went out and looked for it. He didn't riot. And get on your bike almost became a national slogan. That if you were unemployed, that was your own responsibility. If you failed to get a job, then you yourself had to take personal blame. It wasn't a failure of government policy. And it was the same, of course, with poverty overall. This sense of people, if they were in these conditions, then it was a sense, if you like, of a personal defect. And this was very convenient because inequality, as you will all know, exploded during the 1980s. Now, inequality is an irrational thing. That some people are born in families with huge comfort, the odds stacked in their favour from day one, whilst other people are born into families where odds are stacked against them and experience a much shorter, much less comfortable standard of living, where you grow up in Carlton in Glasgow and you have a life expectancy as a man of 53 years, the same as the Gaza Strip, or less than the Gaza Strip, whilst in the richest parts of London you can expect to live 3 decades longer, above all else because of the family in which you were born. So a convenient way of justifying inequality was to say actually that inequality was a reflection of people's contribution and effort. That if you were rich and you were at the top of society, that's because you work hard. You're intelligent, more intelligent than the rest. You're cleverer than the rest. If you're at the bottom of society, again, that is your responsibility. You've failed. You're work shy, you're lazy, you're feckless. You're simply not good enough. And that kind of the individualisation of what was seen before as collective failings is absolutely essential to understand what happened. So the welfare state, if you believe that poverty is a personal failing, then what justification for a welfare state? All it is doing is subsidising people's own failings. That if they need to take responsibility, that means rolling back the state. So that's been used, of course, to justify it. And you see cultural echoes of it, of course. We've seen the rise in the last few years of so-called poverty porn. And what poverty porn is all about is hunting down often the most extreme and unrepresentative examples. In the medieval period, they put people in the stocks and threw vegetables at them. Now we put them on Channel 4 in various documentaries. And what happened, the whole point of this is to show, above all else, again, that these are personal failings. These are personal defects that the individual has to themselves resolve. The media, the press, will hunt down the most extreme and unrepresentative examples of people living in mansions made out of widescreen television sets. Always widescreen television sets. You can't actually buy any other form of television anymore, but we'll park that for now. And people with 50 kids and all the rest. And that is supposed to encourage the idea that these aren't exceptions, this is the tip of the iceberg. Now, the reality in modern Britain is most people in poverty are in work. And these are people who get up in the morning and they earn their poverty day after day. Where we've had, in the last few years, hundreds of thousands of workers, disproportionately women, have been driven into poverty pay. And over the next few years, those at the bottom of society, again, people in work, their income is projected to fall because of cuts to, whether it be cuts to benefits and changes to tax, to take into account, for example, the increase in VAT. So, at the same time, we've had the wealth of the richest 1,000 people has more than doubled during a period of course, one of our greatest economic crises since the 1930s. This is a society where one of the most basic rights of all, or the most basic need other than breathing and drinking water, to eat, is denied of people in what is, of course, the 6th now richest economy on the face of the earth. That hundreds of thousands of people in Britain in 2016 marched to food banks, to charities, in order to satisfy that one of the most basic human needs of all, eating. 300,000 of them kids. The Red Cross, for the first time since World War II, organising emergency food aid for communities. Now, in 1945, after the vanquishing of Nazi tyranny, there was a sense of optimism that there would be constant social progress, that people's problems would have these collective solutions. What horror would they think if they knew in 2016 people would be driven to charities in order to eat? I think that would have been beyond many people's comprehension. That this is a society where millions of families now are languishing on social housing waiting lists, deprived again of one of the most basic rights of all, to have a decent, affordable home for them and for their families. Where, I'm in London, I'm a plastic northern, I've sold out my northern roots, but I live in London, and London is a great city, a booming, wealthy city, where new build properties are snapped up by oligarchs from Russia and the like, and left empty. You can cycle past them as I do, and the windows are all dark, because nobody lives there. Whilst at the same time, 1 in 4 children in that booming, wealthy, metropolitan city grow up in an overcrowded home. And we know the damage of overcrowding to children, in terms of insecurity, in terms of to mental health, to educational attainment, physical health, far more likely to have, for example, asthma as a consequence. It damages not just their potential, but of course all of us as a society, because that potential isn't unlocked. At the same time, because people look, how can this possibly happen? And there are many reasons for it. One is the fact that wages have fallen for the longest period now since the 19th century, since Queen Victoria sat on the throne, that of the advanced industrialised countries, the so-called OECD countries, no country other than Greece, which matches us, has had such a fall in wages over the last few years. So a sudden decrease in wages. At the same time of in-work benefits being cut, of people's access for them taken away. So we'll talk, of course, about the establishment of the financial sector shortly. But needless to say, for example, give me an example. A 60-year-old man called Stephen Taylor. Now, this 60-year-old man is a former soldier, a former serviceman. And he's 60 years old, he's out of work. And if you're out of work at the age of 60, as some of you will know, it's so hard to get work. But he was trying his best. And what he did, as he was searching for work, is he sold poppies for the Royal Legion to raise money for maimed and injured former comrades of his. And he was selling these poppies in a supermarket where he applied for work but was unsuccessful. He had his benefits stopped for 4 weeks, sanctioned, on the basis that his volunteering for the Royal Legion showed he wasn't trying hard enough to look for work. And that is a situation that hundreds of thousands of people have found themselves in. Their benefits are sanctioned, so they have no money. Now, I met a group of young working-class women in wrap-up in Southampton, and they'd had their benefits sanctioned. And what some of them did is they went to food banks, but you can only get referred 3 times, and that's it. Or they went to legal loan sharks.
Can we hear a bit more about Cobbett-Stein, please?
But he's your Cobbett man. I'm not your Cobbett man. The whole point is he talks about Cobbett. I'm relating it to today's time. The legal loan sharks, where they can't afford to pay back those loans, so that they only went to other legal loan sharks in order to pay off. Now, the reason to link it back to his time, this was the time of debtors' prisons, where people were imprisoned by their personal debt. And so history repeats itself. And that's the tragedy. The 19th century was a time of these grave injustices that we were supposed to have wiped out in the 20th century, and they re-emerge again, monstrously so, in the 21st.
Thank you very much. Just to remind the interjection that we are trying to make the link between what Cobbett is saying and the current situation, so it seemed to me that was entirely appropriate. But if you switch the coin over, you also get some rather strange things connected with being rich and the position of the rich. And I know Mr. Cobbett wrote something about the rich.
Well, sir, as all here present will know, I never wrote nor spoke against the wealth of our ancient families and great landowners, where I saw that wealth used wisely and well. I mean, not for their benefit alone, but for the benefit also of the labourers who keep them in that happy state. Mind you, again, I will read to you an address from my address to the journeymen and labourers of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, published in my register in 1816. I wrote, whatever the pride of rank, of riches, or of scholarship may have induced some men to believe, or to affect to believe, the real strength and all the resources of a country ever have sprung and ever must spring from the labour of its people. And hence it is that this nation, which is so small in numbers and so poor in climate and soil compared with so many others, has for many ages been considered the most powerful nation in the world. It is the most industrious, the most laborious, and therefore the most powerful. Elegant dresses, superb furniture, stately buildings, fine roads and canals, fleet horses and carriages, numerous and stout ships, warehouses teeming with goods. All these and many other objects that fall under our view are so many marks of national wealth and resources. But all these spring from labour. Without the journeymen and the labourers, none of them would exist. Without the existence of their hands, the country would be a wilderness, hardly worth the notice of an invader.
I'd like Mr. Jones to comment on that, but just to remind you that in about 5 minutes we will have some questions and observations on these comments. So would you like to comment on the, other side of the coin?
That's a timeless and essential point. This idea of those with wealth, those who dominate our society, that's to do with their own individual endeavour and success. When you can't understand, of course, the wealth, this is a very wealthy society, all too often concentrated in very few hands, without understanding the contribution of all of us as a society, whether it be the real wealth creators, working people who keep our society ticking day after day with their hard graft by hand or by brain, the people who, in the factories, the offices, the supermarkets, the people who keep all of these businesses running. And without that, of course, the wealth wouldn't be created. Now, this is such a topical point because we have this debate at the moment about tax and tax justice. And the debate is because of the refusal of certain large companies to pay tax. And what they do is they go against the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. That's the difference between tax avoidance, which is legal, and tax evasion, which is not. And the argument there is we should change the loopholes that exist, which is, of course, absolutely true, but it's still a choice. Certain companies choose to hunt down and exploit those loopholes, other companies don't. So we have these large accountancy firms that exist in modern Britain, which are up to their neck in industrial tax avoidance. They're seconded to the government, they help draw up the tax law, then they tell their clients how to avoid the very laws they themselves have written in the first place. Can you imagine benefit claimants seconded to the Department of Work and Pensions to draw up legislation on social security, let alone, of course, benefit cheats? Of course, that's absurd. And the reason this is unjust is because, for lots of reasons, but one, take the small businesses, the local coffee shop or the local bookshop. Now, they have to just pay their taxes. If they get their tax form wrong, the tax authorities will come knocking on their door pretty quickly. They can't charge themselves for using their own logo, then offset it against tax. They can't route their sales via low-tax jurisdictions like Ireland. They can't offset losses from foreign entities and put them on their books in this country. They just have to pay their tax, and they're at a competitive disadvantage because they're driven out of business by many of these big businesses that refuse to pay their taxes in the way that they are expected to, because they can't exploit those loopholes. Now, the reason it's so relevant, of course, to what Mr. Cobbett over there says, is because there's almost a sense that tax is it's like a charity, that they're just, these companies are paying it out of the goodness of their own heart, that as well as the collective labour, of course, of those they depend on infrastructure provided by the state, like roads and rail. They depend on research and development. I have an iPhone here, which is smashed, but this iPhone, the touchscreen technology, Siri, the voice that speaks to you when you can command it, the GPS, the internet, are all public sector innovations. They all came through publicly funded research that these companies all depend on. Whether it be, of course, law and order that protects their property, whether it be an education system that trains up their workforce, whether it be the in-work benefits, the welfare state that exists to top up the wages of their workers, which cost billions of pounds every year, because their wages are too low. They're paying too few wages. We could go on. All of these companies depend on the largesse of the state and the labour of people who work for them. And therefore, their side of the bargain is they should contribute accordingly. Now, many of them simply refuse to do so. So that's the point we should make. The other is, what sort of society do we live in where, as I've said before, where most people in poverty and work earning their poverty, whilst during an economic crisis, when things are not getting better in terms of the economy, the wealth, collective wealth is decreasing, but the wealth of the top 1,000 people can double. That is a dysfunctional society. It's a dysfunctional economy. It's an economy rigged in favour of a tiny elite rather than the interests, of course, of the majority. And that costs. We all have to pay money. We all have to pay billions of pounds every year to top up people's wages as a consequence, where the gap between workers and CEOs has exploded in size in the last 20 years. Now, we can pretend CEOs are working, 50 times harder than they were in the late 1990s. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that's the case. But again, you have a society rigged in their favour, where even before the crash happened, even before 2008, the wages of millions of workers were either stagnating or falling, with terrible consequences for the economy. People not spending money, because when low-paid workers get money in their pockets, they go out and spend it. Whether it be more and more personal debt, a recurring theme, of course, of the 19th century, as people try to top up their living standards, and whether it be more and more money spent on in-work benefits. So these are social injustices that didn't just explode in a spectacular way after 2008, but actually are to do with the way society is run long before then. So that's why these problems were getting worse and worse. So the argument when it comes to the rich, to big business and all the rest, is you can't just look at success as being an individual flourish of individual talent. Of course, talent plays its part. It's a collective endeavour. And if it's a collective endeavour, our society should be run to recognise that fact. And that means rich people paying taxes properly, paying their workers properly, because if we don't have that society, then we have a society that's not run in the interests of all of us, but run as a playground for a tiny elite. That's what existed in the 19th century. We were supposed to abolish that, but we've been marching back to that for a very long time indeed.
Thank you. It's certainly time for some comments and questions from the floor. We'll have one question from here, and then we'll ask the Barley Room to submit us a question as well. So perhaps anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment?
Or heckle.
Or heckle. I can see one hand up there, sir. Yes. Is there a mic somewhere? Yes, there is.
I'll hold it. Can we go back to the time of COVID and how they worked the poverty system? It was done locally, and they used to raise local taxes, and this used to be distributed by those who were elected amongst the community according to the requirements of individuals. And there was a connection where they knew that if they didn't look after people and employ them on a part-time basis, then what do they call it? They call it the wealth tax. It wasn't a wealth tax. That's more locally. The workers' tax used to go up, but if a fund was reduced because they were able to bring people back into work, the great thing is it was so much easier doing it locally in the country than what we're having today. That's the main point I made in Cobbett's favour, the way he ran his affairs, because Cobbett used to say, if we don't look after these people, we're going to put the taxes up in the area, and therefore these people were looked after far quicker.
Okay, well, that seems like an observation rather than a comment. It was done.
I thought we could make observations.
Yes, you can. It was done on a parish basis, which is hardly possible to manage these days.
Well, I wanted to put Cobbett's name forward against today.
There's perhaps, is there a question from the Barley Room? Is that being geared up yet? This is a test of technology.
Talking about material poverty, of course, you could say spiritual poverty. There are different types. When mainly we're talking about material poverty and having money to buy bread, but also, you could be spiritually poor. You see, sort of thing, different things.
That seemed to be a question about spiritual as distinct from physical poverty.
What does that mean,
Perhaps while they're sorting out the technology, we can have another question here. I see a hand near the back.
You seem to be moving into the question of companies working across international boundaries and using that to exploit the situation and be able to reduce their tax. To what extent do you believe that the globalization element is a new one, and to what extent was it something that would have existed in the 19th century? Are we facing a new dynamic because of the internationalization, which allows a large multinational to sell books and not pay tax, while our little local shops do pay tax?
Well, of course, I mean, globalisation's... I mean, Karl Marx wrote quite prophetically about globalisation back in the 19th century, which was the need of particularly large companies to eradicate artificial boundaries in terms of being able to move goods, jobs and services. So obviously that's something which goes back a long time. It has been dramatically accelerated, not least, of course, since the 1980s in particular. Now, I suppose the point about, because the argument now is, and this is an argument often, for kind of impotence in the face of massive industrial tax avoidance, is if you attempt to remedy it, then they will simply relocate to another country, which they can do very, very easily indeed. And I think the point there actually is clearly there are things that each country can do individually, and actually we have seen some action. It's not enough, but on the national scale, which is very positive. But obviously we can only genuinely, in the case of tax avoidance, we can talk about tax havens, for example. We've seen quite recently an example of that, the Panama tax scandal, that you need international coordinated action. And again, we are getting some of that. And it's important to make that point because sometimes those of us like myself who believe in social justice, we wallow in defeats, we wallow in the injustices as they exist rather than saying, well, actually, there's something we can do about it. And it's important to do that because you've got to build people's confidence up because otherwise people give up all the futility of it all. So we are seeing at the EU level, obviously we're now leaving the European Union, but you've had action taken. So what we've seen, for example, at the moment with Google is they've been told to cough up money because of their relationship with Ireland. It's bizarre, Ireland is now trying to sue the European Union to stop Google paying them. But anyway, but they are now, so you are getting that international action. You've had that on a global scale. And that's only happened because people campaigned for it. Tax avoidance was an issue which was on the margins of political debate many years ago. But I think in the aftermath of the crash in particular, people were told there simply isn't enough money. We just have to cut back our spending because we have a deficit between what we spend and what we bring in. And the response of people like in this country, UK Uncut, but other tax campaigners was, hang on a minute, you're telling us there isn't enough money whilst these very rich companies and individuals aren't paying the taxes they should pay. And that's been what's galvanised this as an issue in the last few years. And it is making an impact. But yes, I think it's a two-pronged attack. You can do things here. I don't think we should second accountancy firms to the Treasury to draw up tax laws. I think that's an obvious conflict of interest. But equally, we should be taking international action, building on the limited action we've had, some progress though, but we've got to build far more. And it's not just this country that suffers. It's estimated, of course, that, well, all the research shows it's the poorer countries who suffer the most, that people, their lives, in terms of their actual lives, are imperiled because of the lack of money available, partly because of international tax avoidance. So we can do things, we have done things, we just need to do a lot more.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll move on rather than struggle with the technology, but then we'll give the other group.
The question in the Barley Room is waiting to be repeated, if that's okay.
They are waiting to repeat it. All right. Can we repeat the question from the Barley Room? No. It seems that we can't. We'll move on to another theme, really, a theme which is obviously closely linked to this one, the idea of money, banking, credit, etc. And I know that Mr. Cobbett wrote at great length on these matters.
On the subject of bankers and jobbers, sir, well, as our young friend and I agree, the poor are always with us, but it has been said, so are the rich. And sadly, some among those who are not rich maintain the desire to be rich, or at least the desire not to appear poor, and hence that destructive thing honoured with the name of speculation, but which ought to be called gambling. A time was when money jingled in your purse or your pocket. That's the kind of money I paid those working for me, and I paid fair. I promised to pay the bearer £1. A fine promise indeed, when there is not gold enough in the bank to pay, to keep it. Credit has its place. But nowadays rich, I mean the rich establishment of my time, feed themselves upon boundless credit on the backs of the poor working man. Real money, real cash, or this paper stuff. The power which money gives is the power of brute force. It is the power of the bayonet and the bludgeon. Now, something I wrote, Tom Paine put me onto it when I was in Newgate. Yeah. A letter from Newgate. I wrote, I hold that a false or paper money, not convertible into gold or silver on demand on the issue of the paper, is one of the greatest scourges ever inflicted upon a nation. I hold that it is the weight of taxes which produces all these miseries which this nation now suffers, and that these taxes go in part to keep sinecure placemen, pensioners and grantees, of whose public service I can find no trace. The trouble is this damned funding system, I beg your pardon, ladies, I refer to the business of printing money to pay the interest on the national debt, while out there be stock jobbers and bankers ready to make a mint as the taxes grow and more money gets printed to make a funding system built on credit. I mean, in this new age of yours, I cannot believe that there are greedy bankers or unscrupulous jobbers, or that money gets printed to ease things for the banks when they get into trouble. No, sir, surely that cannot be.
Any comment on that, Mr. Jones?
No, it's all fine. No, things have definitely improved. Yeah, blimey. I was at Tory Party conference for 4 days, lucky old me. And it was interesting that Theresa May did a speech, and she said that since the financial crisis, it's been ordinary working class people, not the financial sector, that has been expected to pay the greatest crisis, which I thought was slightly odd, because it was almost like she was a disinterested observer who's just been, like a columnist almost, who's just stroking her chin and going, what has happened in the last few years? I mean, not one of the pillars of the government who supported and implemented policies like the cutting of in-work benefits, like the failure to build housing, like the creation predominantly of less paid insecure work. But there you have it. But she was obviously absolutely right in her detached observer status, that a crisis was caused by the financial sector and those who failed to regulate them, but the price was paid, of course, by millions of people who had nothing to do with the crash whatsoever. And I think what's interesting is what we saw, of course, it was under both the Conservatives and New Labour, because one of the claims of, or the narrative spun by the Conservatives, they backed every single penny that Labour spent on schools and hospitals till the end of 2008. Every single penny they backed. But what they said in the aftermath was one of the main reasons we're in this crash because Labour spent too much money, when the real failure, of course, is to regulate a financial sector. Now, what we've seen, particularly from the 70s onwards, again under successive governments of all political stripes, is the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector with a economy which has been increasingly geared around the needs of the financial sector based in London and the South East. And that has obviously caused a huge imbalance in the economy, which is why the crash which happened in this country was so acute. Now, if we look at what's happened, and I think this is just the point I made before about benefit sanctioning, the banks were not bailed out by free market dogma, they were bailed out by the states. They effectively became the most lavishly supported benefit claimant in Britain, but with two key differences. The amount of money they got, hundreds of billions of pounds, not a pathetic, derisory amount, but critically, so few strings attached to the support they got. So our banks pay more top bonuses to those at the top of the banks than every European Union country put together, where they didn't lend properly to small businesses in the aftermath of the crash, helping to choke off a recovery from a crash they had caused. Well, obviously, nobody went to prison for what happened. Whilst at the other end, you get benefit claimants, their support, their pathetic, derisory support, becomes ever more conditional or is simply taken away altogether. And it is a case, if you like, that if you're at the top of society, the financial sector, the state will come rushing to your rescue, give you all the money you need with so few strings attached, while those at the bottom of society, their support has become ever more conditional, taken away. And if you like, it's socialism for the rich, and it's capitalism, sink or swim, for everybody else. That we do have statism in this country, but it is statism for powerful vested interests, while the state is rolled back, but for those who need support the most. And that defines this society in which we live. One rule for those at the top, one rule for everybody else. And what's happened since the financial crash, as Theresa May so eloquently put it, as a disinterested, impartial observer, is that those who had nothing to do with it have paid the price. Now, we will have a rebalancing of our economy by the looks of things, because we'll be leaving the single market and the financial sector won't be getting passport access. Now, that's not quite what people were asking for on my wing of politics, if you like. We wanted a rebalancing to build up the industries of the future like Germany have done, where they've seen the climate change crisis as an opportunity. So they've had an industrial strategy to build up renewable energy industries with secure jobs, backed up with apprenticeships for younger people. But we're not going to have that. We will have London's economy, as things stand, taking a battering, the financial services contracting, without, obviously, unless there's a dramatic change in strategy, to build up those industries. So that will be not, you know, when people say we want to rebalance the economy from the financial sector, we ain't saying just trash it and then don't build up the industries of the future to replace it. So we need now, finally to wrap up, to build a different sort of society where the financial sector isn't a casino which operates, if you like, to serve the whims of top bankers who are paid extortionate bonuses, where the risks are, if you like, we nationalise the risks and we privatise the profits. We have a financial sector that is different. It runs in the interests of people in this country, whilst we have a new industrial strategy to build up the industries of the future. But until we have a society that is not run with one rule for some people and one rule for everybody else, then we won't be able to build that sort of society.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And let's move on to some questions. I think we should give the next room priority. Does it have any mics working so that we can hear what's being said? Barley room, questions?
I could just pop over and ask. They're there. I mean... yeah. There's just one rule for people here, it's one rule for... Honestly, it's injustice. Look at it.
Owen, while we're waiting, you wouldn't have just let the banks collapse.
No, that's not the argument we're making at all. What we should have done is take proper democratic public control of the banks, and actually, instead of... Basically, what we did is we nationalised the profit, and... Sorry, we didn't do that. We nationalised the risks and we privatised the profit, so the banks were able to continue much as they always did. We should have actually had accountable public control. You don't just give them a load of money, allow them to carry on paying as much bonuses as they were paying before, and not lend to small businesses. So I would have had a properly accountable financial system, which would have been transforming the nature of it. We didn't do that. We just said, as things were before, with that public support.
So there have been nationalised banks paying not the going rate for their executives and things of that kind. Is that what you...
Yeah, we've moved more in line with other European countries, like Germany, for example.
How are we doing next door?
It's not alive yet, Mr. Chairman.
Not alive yet. I think the next time we wait for questions, you might just run in and take a question and then come back in. Is that all right?
That, doesn't it?
It's not far.
Why don't we just get someone to come in? That makes sense, doesn't it? Just pop in and then wave.
Any questions from this room on the issue of...
I could ring them, maybe.
Yes,
Put them on speakerphone.
There's a question there, or an observation, comment, yeah?
You talk about Theresa May. Can you take any comfort from her current rhetoric I mean, she is rather dispassionate in the way she speaks about anything, particularly in light of the fact that in the past she has faced down a few of our shibboleths, like the Boys in Blue, and shown quite a lot of courage in that regard. Do you think the rhetoric now about inequality is empty, or do you have some hope?
Well, I think I would say that yes, it's a vindication for people making these arguments for a very long time. People who were ridiculed and attacked and demonised as though they were beyond the pale, because she made an argument about tax justice, including that it's not just the individual by themselves, it's a collective endeavour, that people have paid as I keep saying, paid the price for those at the top of society, that we live in a very unequal society. These are arguments, as I've said, that have been ridiculed and mocked. And I think, yes, what we should say is we've won the argument. But in her actual record, because we've not heard, there's no evidence on economic issues that she's actually spoken out about these things. And I have to say, and this will maybe divide the room, that one of her first flagship policies is to reintroduce secondary moderns into this country. We used to have secondary moderns on a national scale, where most people were written off at a young age, including my own uncle, disproportionately working class people, while overwhelmingly middle class people sent to grammar schools. And in Kent, we have selection still in place, and there the outcomes for poorer children are much worse than they are in London, where you don't have selection. The evidence, 17% of Kent are on free school meals, 3% of people in grammar schools in Kent are on free school meals. So just by her one flagship policy, which even David Cameron regarded as unacceptable for that reason, then if I'm judging her by that alone, then I think her rhetoric is empty. But of course, I'm more than willing to hear what she's going to do to create the skilled, secure jobs of the future, what she's going to do to deal with the housing crisis, and that she has to be scrutinised on the basis of that substance. But it was George Osborne, let's not forget, who said powerfully, emotionally, we're all in this together. That was not borne out, of course, by the evidence, and she has a long way to go until she convinces us that the rhetoric that she's just come up with is any less empty than the rhetoric of George Osborne.
I think we have a question from next door that has arrived to ask it.
So I was just going to ask, it's a very powerful critique, but I'm interested to know, given that so many of the collective institutions that kind of helped us create a much fairer society have been eroded since Thatcherism, what you think what are the building blocks, where do we need to start to recreate that kind of collective sensibility and to roll back some of the sort of desolation of some of the communities that we've seen around, not Farnham particularly, but around the country?
That's a very good point. I think the Labour movement is still the biggest democratic movement in the country. It represents over 6 million wealth creators who keep this country ticking, who we all depend on. But I think it has to change in its nature, because in the 1950s, and so what to glamorise that time, because these jobs that people did were backbreaking and dirty. They were dominated by men. But you had obviously communities based around mines and steelworks and factories in a way you don't have around supermarkets and call centres. I mean, as many people now work in call centres as work down the mines at the peak of the mining industry, and work is more transient. You used to have, again, very male-dominated work, so I'm not glamorising it, but people would often do the same job throughout their whole life, the same as their dad often, and people now often do lots of different jobs. So what the trade unions have to do is not just organise in the workplace, but organise on the community level as well. That means learning from youth community workers, and it means having a different approach. I mean, in the aftermath of the riots, which started in Tottenham in 2011, there's a guy I know, Simeon Brown, he's a youth community worker, and he got young people to come and play football and then talk about issues that affected them with local community leaders and politicians. Most people, of course, don't turn up to political meetings. They often have better things to do.
Communities are equally transient. I'm the only one of my family that still lives in London, for example, of a big family. We've got transient communities too, as well.
It depends. I mean, about 70% of Britain live about 5 miles away from where they were born. So, but in places like London, that's certainly the case. You have often very transient populations. But even there, you get, in London, you have Citizens UK, which bring together often, obviously, people, faith-based communities, but others, to try and deal with the scourge of poverty. And that is often attracting, for example, migrant populations. You'll get trade unions, actually, for example, like the cleaners on the underground, who are often all recently arrived, or they're all migrants, and they're collectively organised as well. So you can get that. And there was a tradition in the 19th century of getting Irish migrants and the rest. They could often be the most organised and determined. So I do think you can get, you know, there are precedents for that. I don't think you just have to be a settled population. Is it easy? No, but there are examples of it. Another example, I talked about tax justice in UK Uncut. That was young people coming together and occupying shops and businesses whose owners weren't paying their tax. They drove that issue on the agenda in quite a new and exciting way. They used social media to organise people, so they weren't giving out leaflets or pamphlets, as William Cobbett did back in his day. They used social media to get people to occupy those shops and businesses, and it had a success. So I think there are those movements that do exist. It's not easy, but we do, you know, as I've said, actually in this country, back in the 19th century, it was often migrants and people from newly arrived people who could often be the most organised and dedicated, and that's still the case today. And I think of London Underground cleaners and other living wage campaigners in London. Often the people who've won the living wage are themselves cleaners from who've only recently arrived. So it is possible, even if it's not always that easy.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time we moved on to the next subject we want to look at, which is dear to the hearts of both our speakers, which is the press. And I know that Mr. Cobbett has some quite strong thoughts on the freedom of the press.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I would be pleased to know from Mr. Jones the state of the press in your time. In my time, papers like the True Britain and the Standard were paid for with public money just to eulogise Pitt and his minions. Later, the Pilot and the Standard were established by the government to oppose my register. And I cannot refrain from mentioning the influence of newspapers, or the influence of advertisements in the newspapers. Let me read what I wrote again the second time I was thrown into Newgate. May I? The liberty of the press, I wrote, is a mere name and has no existence in reality, where any man cannot, without risk of harm to himself, publish the truth respecting the public character, conduct, and measures of men in public office. Some papers, the Morning Post in particular, are the property of companies, of traders, of speculators. The thing is regarded as a money-making speculation, and the most profitable policies will always be preferred. In all the daily papers, paragraphs from individuals or bodies of men are inserted for payment. The price is enormous, not less than a guinea an inch. Of course, the rich villain has the whole of the daily press for his defender or apologist, while the oppressed or slandered man, if he be poor, has no means whatever of appealing to the justice of the public. Well, Mr. Jones, what think you of that, and have things changed?
Have things changed, Mr. Jones?
Well, first, of course, you were persecuted in your day for standing up for freedom of expression. I think you should give him a round of applause. Just so... He's a martyr in the struggle. Look, we're told we have a free press in this country, and that's true in the sense the government doesn't control the press. We're not North Korea, not a very ambitious place to start, to be honest with you. But I don't want to belittle that point, because in other countries, journalists are persecuted, imprisoned, as he was in his day, tortured and murdered. So there does need to be a bit of perspective. However, in this country, much of the press, most of the press, is run by a very, very small group of very rich media moguls who are a part of a status quo, of course, it's in their interest to defend. Rather than being a source of, the means of information, a pillar of democracy that exists to scrutinise the powerful, it's an instrument of the powerful. It's a means, if you monopolise the means of information, that gives you a huge amount of political influence, which is wielded very effectively, of course, by those with power. Now, before I go on to what that means in practice, that can become a crutch for people like me. And the danger is, by what I mean is, we just go, well, the reason we haven't succeeded, it's the press, They go around brainwashing everyone, and that's a very patronising way of looking at people. If you just reduce them to robots or sheep, it's not only patronising, it's also defeatist, because if you believe that, then there's no hope. If people are though so easily brainwashed, and I think if we had an inspiring alternative backed up by a movement that can reach people, then we would be able to overcome that influence. It needs a sophisticated strategy to deal with. But in any case, as well as the fact the media is dominated by such a small, or the press is by such a small group of people, what you've got is journalists are unrepresentative of a country, of a society that they exist to serve. And there's lots of different reasons for that. One is hard to deal with, if you like. It's the decline of local newspapers, which has been happening for a very long time. And local newspapers were often a means of training up aspiring working class journalists. Again, without being rose-tinted about an era in which I wasn't there, but people could leave school at the age of 16, make tea at the local newspaper and climb the ranks. And some of the older political journalists, that's how they started. They didn't actually go to university at all. But there were two other, I think, more pernicious and more easy to solve problems as well. One is the rise of the unpaid internship, where you're expected often in my profession to work for free for months, if not longer, and you need to do that in order to get it on your CV to hope to get a job of any description at the end of it. There's no guarantee of a job at the end of that either. Now, often that's in London, which is one of the most expensive cities on the face of the earth. And if you have parents with the financial means, then perhaps you can afford to do that, but most people can't. So we end up discriminating on the basis not of people's ability, but on the basis of people's wealth, or their parents' wealth. The same with the rise of postgraduate qualifications, which are ever more essential to get a job in the media, postgraduate qualifications in journalism. Very expensive, thousands of pounds in fees, plus living costs. Most people can't afford to do that. So according to the government's own research, over half of the top 100 journalists are privately educated, but only 7% of people in Britain go to private schools. 14 or 15% or so of those top journalists went to a comprehensive. 90% of us go to comprehensive schools in Britain. So they're completely unrepresentative of modern Britain. And the other point is, because of, I think, cumulative impact of ownership and the sorts of people working there, is partly the, if you like, the spreading of myths. And again, people have agency. I'm not just saying people are brainwashed. But in modern Britain, people think, on average, benefit fraud is 27% of spending on social security. According to the government's own figures, it's only 0.7%. People think benefits are far higher, that they go to people, they don't know which people they go to, because over half, rightly, of the welfare state goes to pensioners. People think there are 20 times more teenage pregnancies than there are. They think immigration is much higher than it is, that there are far many people, far more British Muslims than there actually are. And that is partly because of a media that doesn't challenge myths, that doesn't challenge prejudice, but instead fans prejudice and division, that spreads, if you like, misinformation to say the least, and focuses on extreme examples of people often at the bottom of society and portrays them as the tip of the iceberg. And I think that's wrong. I think we should have a free press that genuinely challenges the powerful, that challenges myths, even if that's unpopular to do so, that speaks truth to power. We don't have that press, but my word, that is a press we should aspire to.
Thank goodness you didn't mention the Daily Mail.
There's still time.
We're kind of moving towards the last third of our evening, and I did want to, it's rather a two-part subject here, I did want to have a look at our international engagements, because Mr. Cobbett certainly had quite a lot to say about this country's enthusiasm for foreign wars, and I wonder if that's still the case today. So, Mr. Cobbett, what did you feel about this matter?
Well, sir, we fought Napoleon Bonaparte because we had to. If we had not taken him, he would have taken us. We fought the Americans in 1812 when we needn't. Pray, listen to what I wrote in 1808. I wrote, "The recent intelligence from India, or our empire in the East, is of such a gloomy complexion in my sight, inasmuch as it gives an account of the loss of a great number of English officers and soldiers. It may serve to make men reflect justly on the nature of the wars we carry on in India, and may lead them to the conclusion, so much to be desired, namely, that the possession of that country is a terrible evil. This, it seems, we are told, is to be the last war. But we've been told the same thing for more than 30 years past. There is a constant, never-ceasing war in India. There is not always actual fighting, but there is always going on preparations for fighting. What right in God's name do we have to do this? How is it possible for us to justify our conduct upon any principle of morality? Mr. Jones, it was always my fervent wish that Great Britain would refrain from military adventures overseas. Yep. Have I been disappointed?
Oh dear, bad news, I'm afraid. So, you know, if we look at Iraq, those of us who opposed Iraq War, myself included, were wrong, because we didn't realise quite how bad the consequences would have been. And they were calamitous. Hundreds of thousands of people died, millions of people displaced, millions of people traumatised, a society which collapsed into sectarian bloodbath over, I mean, one of the main, lots of pretexts for what happened, and we now know, given the inquiry this year, which vindicated many of the arguments of the anti-war movement in the build-up to that absolute disaster, the calamitous disaster, where people like Robin Cook resigned from the cabinet, saying explicitly that Iraq, in his opinion, having seen the intelligence briefings, did not have weapons of mass destruction in the sense that was understood. And not only that, there was a suggestion that Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, there was some relationship there. Well, Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq before the war, but in the aftermath, of course, absolutely overran it. And what's even worse is Al-Qaeda now are on the brink of defeat in Iraq and Syria, not at the hands of the West, but the hands of an even more extreme and tyrannical and murderous group than themselves, ISIS, a group which again emerged in its full glory, its horrific glory in Iraq and, of course, in Syria. So that was a calamity. The same with Libya. And again, Libya was if you opposed the war at the time, and this is always the case, you're portrayed as being an appeaser. 1930s rhetoric is brought up. They're the new Hitler. You're the equivalent of the appeasers of the time. Gaddafi, of course, quite recently before that, had become an ally of the West. And it was very Orwellian. We've always been at war with Eurasia and so on and so forth. Now, what were the consequences of what happened in Libya? Well, originally the argument was to save Benghazi from a bloodbath. Now, the House of Commons Parliamentary Committee cast doubt in their inquiry that that was going to happen. But critically, the pretext for getting involved wasn't regime change, but to protect Benghazi. As that report revealed, that happened within 24 hours of the airstrikes. But obviously those airstrikes continued until the regime fell. Now, what was the aftermath? And Gaddafi was a horrendous tyrant, as I think people who were more consistent argued when Britain and other countries were cozying up to him. But what we saw, again, was the collapse of civil society, the massacre of black Africans in Libya, the rise, again, of ISIS, the spreading of guns across North Africa, leading to the destabilisation of Mali. Again, terrible ills, and now Libya is on the brink of becoming the Somalia of the Mediterranean, a failed state. Now, again, these were arguments that were made at the time which were belittled and ignored, and at such huge human cost. And again, if we look at our foreign policy and the inconsistencies, one of our key chief allies is, of course, Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is a regime which chops the heads off people for being gay and for being dissidents, treats women in the most abhorrent way imaginable, has no free elections, political parties, trade unions, nothing. And they're currently bombing Yemen with British bombs that we armed them with. And, when the Saudi dictator died, what did we do? We lowered our flag to half-mast to mourn his passing. Now, I went to Djibouti a few weeks ago, a refugee camp in Djibouti. And this was full of children fleeing Yemen's war. And I met these young kids, a little girl, 11 years old, and you expect kids to draw pictures of swings and animals and all the rest. And she drew this picture of what happened in her country with aeroplanes dropping missiles, of destruction and people lying in their own blood. And this is a war which we don't even talk about in Yemen, in this country. There is almost no understanding of what is happening there. A third of all Saudi targets are civilian targets, as it's found. They've killed more, that coalition, twice as many more as every other force in that war put together. And this country's up to its neck in it. I don't think, as well as being barbaric in terms of the consequences, I don't think it makes us safer. I think it makes us less safe. And instead of arming to the teeth a regime like Saudi Arabia, which is bombing civilians and treating its own citizens in the most barbaric way, we should be standing up to those sorts of dictatorships, because Saudi Arabia is exporting the sort of extremism that puts people in this room at risk, your children, your communities, and this country. And instead of confronting them, not least as they unleash mayhem, and I've seen the consequences firsthand, we cozy up to them. We need a new foreign policy that has peace and human rights at its heart, and that's not just a wishy-washy, bleeding heart thing to say. It's for our own good, for our security as well as their security. And again, when will we ever learn? As Albert Einstein was once said to, well, people argue he didn't say it, but it's a brilliant quote, whoever said it. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And that has been British foreign policy for far too long, and we need a radical change if we're going to have a foreign policy that actually helps the security of the world as well as the security of people in this country as well. Thank you.
Any government that gets into bed with the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia needs its head examining. Mr. Cobbett, do you have a question for Mr. Jones?
Final question, sir. Well, yes, there is a thing that has been on my mind all evening, a question I offer it both to the admirable Mr. Jones and to our splendid audience. It concerns the ladies here present and across the kingdom. I wrote, if I recall correctly, I wrote, women are a sisterhood. They make common cause on behalf of the sex, and this is quite natural in view of the immense power that the law gives us over them. Looking at the ladies here tonight, I would say that that power appears to be much diminished. Mr. Jones, do you think, it is an outlandish question, but nevertheless, do you think that we should be looking at some time in the future to women being allowed to vote in parliamentary elections?
What a far-fetched, crazy idea. Honestly, it will never catch on. I think it's worth remembering because, I mean, partly in terms of hope and all the rest, that everything we have, all our rights and freedoms, were won not by the generosity of the powerful, but the sacrifice and struggle of people we don't give enough homage to. And, you know, the powerful didn't wake up one day and say, oh, I'm feeling generous, I'll give women the vote for a laugh. People had to fight at huge cost and huge sacrifice. And these days, the suffragettes are almost secular saints, but in their time, they were reviled. They were hated. They were anarchists. They were terrorists. They were dragged from protest by police officers, thrown into cells, and had tubes forced down their noses. And it was only because of their struggle and sacrifice that women won the right to vote. And if we look still, because we still have so far to go, because if we look at our parliament today, yes, women now, of course, have the right to vote and stand as MPs, which they didn't, despite the views of more enlightened voices, rare as they were in the 19th century. Again, only 23% of our MPs are women. That well-known bastion of feminism, Sudan, has more women in its parliament as a percentage than we do. Would it be the fact that women are still concentrated in the lowest paid and most insecure work? That the result of cuts to public services and to social security has disproportionately hit women? That we live in a country where 1.4 million women every single year suffer from domestic violence, where 1 to 2 women every single week are killed by a current or a former partner, when hostels are closing for women fleeing domestic violence because there's not enough funding for them, where Women's Aid, a couple of years ago, I can't imagine it getting much better, 230 women and children were being turned away every day because of a lack of funding, because of cuts to local authorities on who those hostels depended on. That this is a country where 400,000 women face sexual assault every single year at the hands of men, where 90,000 women are raped every single year, and the vast majority of those cases does not end in justice. The vast majority of men who sexually assault women and rape women do not end up with justice as a consequence. And that is a damning indictment still of this country. Yes, we've come so far, but there is huge complacency still, I think, in terms of how far we have to go. And what I think feminism has done is change men too, for the better, but there's still a long way to go, because men are expected at an early age to abide by strict gender norms of what it is to be a man. And that is, if you're not seen as aggressive enough, you don't leer at women enough, you don't conform to this rigid form of masculinity, then you can expect abuse. You know, you're like a girl, you're gay or whatever. And the reason that's damaging for men as well is because women are more likely to encounter mental distress, but more likely to seek help. If men encounter mental distress, it's seen as unmanly to talk about their problems. So the biggest killer of men in Britain under the age of 50 is suicide. Over 3/4 of suicides are men. And part of that problem is that, gender policing, if you like, from an early age. So the struggle of women's liberation has helped to some degree men, because it's allowed men to talk more about their problems, to have women as friends on an equal footing in the way they didn't, and LGBT friends for that matter, to have more of a role in childcare and raising families than they once did. But there is still so far to go. This is still a sexist and misogynistic country where women are not treated equally and still suffer male violence, are still paid less, still face more insecurity, and when cuts happen, suffer disproportionately the consequences. And any movement for social justice is no movement worthy of the name unless the struggle for women's rights and women's liberation, it is at absolute core. Yes, things have changed since then, but we should learn from those examples in order to give us more confidence to finish the job. And it's women who have to be obviously at the absolute forefront, and men have to listen and to learn and to stand by women when they ask men to speak out to overcome these injustices.
Thank you very much, Owen. That was great. Now, we have about 10 minutes maximum to go, and I think we'll have some quick Q&A. I know there was one question over there, and I think we'll get perhaps 2 or 3 people in the next room if they wish to either come or write down their questions. But I know there was a question or observation here.
Hello?
Yeah. Go ahead.
On the 4th of April 2013, an early day motion in the House of Commons, sponsored by the late Michael Meacher, MP for Oldham, Cobbett's own constituency, marked the 250th anniversary of Cobbett's birth and his efforts to support the 1832 Reform Act. The motion also welcomed the efforts of the William Cobbett Society to celebrate his birthday and raise his profile. 16 of the 24 signatories were Labour MPs, including Jeremy Corbyn, Islington North, and John McDonnell, Hayes and Harlington. I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
I'm not massively surprised, I'll be honest with you. I remember actually, because I used to work over a decade ago, blimey, I worked for John McDonnell at a time when, what I did is I wrote, when I finished university, I was working as a barman for a while, and I wrote letters to every single Labour MP who voted against the Iraq War and got massive rejections because MPs are always overwhelmed with applications. But John McDonnell got back in touch, and I worked for trade unions in his office for a while. But one of the things I had to do is get together early day motions and do a ring round of people to sign up to them. EDMs, for those who don't know, are like parliamentary petitions. don't have any legal footing, the way of MPs raising issues and causes, including, of course, the likes of, as you say, William Cobbett there. And one of the other signatories was Peter Bottomley, a Conservative MP, and I could always rely on Peter Bottomley to basically sign any EDM I gave him, because he was a bizarre kind of maverick Conservative. He was the head of the Conservative Trade Union Group, which sounds a bit like a contradiction. He was a very passionate trade unionist as well as a Conservative, but he had this kind of sense for a radical history. So he was the Conservative, as he often was the token Conservative on the kind of a radical EDM. And I suppose it's interesting because we do live in a time, obviously, of political tumult and ferment, and it's difficult to know. I mean, Labour is in a period of huge internal crisis, but I suppose, you know, there is that what we need to do, and I think the Labour leadership obviously faces lots of challenges, its own problems it has to overcome, its own failings it has to overcome as well, despite obviously as well the huge odds stacked against it. But it's that sense that we always have to remember is to have a broad historical sweep, because change, as I've said, is not easy. There's this sense of change, and that's why we have to remember our ancestors, like William Cobbett over there, because the sense we often have is change is it's a case of victory, success, but that's not the case. It's often setback, defeat, and then victory in the end. And the likes of William Cobbett faced often very lonely battles indeed. He was persecuted and locked up, of course, as so many people were back in our day. And the reason I raise that is because when we look at what seem often like insurmountable odds that we face, they were far greater in those days. And that should give us heart. Yes, it's right to remember the sacrifice of those who came before us because it's the right thing to do, because we should remember their sacrifice, but it's also a reminder of how difficult change can be, but how it can eventually be achieved, even if it means suffering and persecution and demonisation and all the rest. And as I said, we don't have the same persecution they had back then. And the odds we face are easier to overcome, even though they look formidable. So that should give us heart. These are difficult times. These are times when lots of people are scared and insecure and well, frightened beyond belief in some cases about the future we have. But we need to remember the contributions of those who came before. Whatever you think about Tony Benn, what he always said is the way you get change is the burning flame of anger at injustice and the burning flame of hope at a better world. That's what the likes of William Cobbett, of course, had in spades. And we need to keep those flames alive. We need to find ways of building a broad movement that can communicate with the majority. And you know, he was a great communicator. And all of us, the Labour Party, the Labour leadership, all of us who want them to succeed, we need to learn from that. How do we make what we argue for accessible? But let's remember these traditions a bit more. It's a patriotic tradition, dare I say, a patriotic tradition of the people who stood up to injustice. And all of us in this room, and in the other room, all of us should stand in that great tradition of William Cobbett. And that's what that early day motion was all about, reminding people in the House of Parliament that that rights and freedoms were won by people, and you should, at your peril, undermine those rights and freedoms. Because if people fought for them in the past, as he did, they'll fight for them again. And that's a great tradition we should remember.
Yeah. Thank you. Does the technology allow us to have a question from next door? Or is somebody going to come and deliver the question? While we're waiting for the question, I have an observation that I...
Oh, hello. Yes, hello. Hi.
Okay.
It's like a Ouija board, this, isn't it? So
is that working?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
I'd just like, you've talked about secondary schools and grammar schools, but I'd just like to sort of think about £50,000 worth of debt for our young people if they go to university, and what you think about the commodification of university education, about the rise of mental health problems in universities, where students are finding it really hard to engage with their studies, knowing that they're going to come out with this massive debt. How can they take risks? How can they, you know, push forward like people having history to, you know, think about new ways of living when all they're worried about is you know, vocational degrees, if you like, and how they're going to pay this debt off that is £200 a month in interest. Even.
I think we're clear about the question, if we don't mind moving on to some comments from
Well,
Owen.
just on that, look, young people have disproportionately borne the brunt of what's happened in the last few years. The scrapping of the educational maintenance allowance, a tiny amount of money to support working class people with the aspiration to stay on an education, the trebling of tuition fees, punishing aspiration with debt, the cutting of youth services, often the first to go, the lack of affordable housing disproportionately affects younger people, cuts to social security disproportionately affects younger people, the lack of secure jobs, underemployment, zero-hour contracts, all disproportionately affect younger people. A slide in income of 10% amongst the younger generation over the last few years. So we've got to see that debt in the broader context of what young people have had to suffer. And I think education is a social good. I think we all benefit, of course, the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, all of us depend on that, if you like. And what we've seen as a consequence of tuition fees, and we don't talk about this enough, one example is a massive reduction in courses. If you compare to Scotland, where they don't have tuition fees, there's a much broader range of courses. We've seen a stark reduction as people make choices on the basis, if you like, of financial transactions. How am I going to make sure I get, you know, a certain amount of money because of the amount of debt I'm going to have? So people often go to universities they wouldn't otherwise go to, again, because of that fear of debt. We've seen a massive collapse in part-time numbers. This is one of the things we don't talk about. Tens of thousands of fewer part-time workers since tuition fees were introduced. And these are overwhelmingly working-class people over the age of 25. Will Houghton, the writer, has said it's one of the biggest blows to social mobility we've had for a generation in this country, and we don't talk about that enough. And of course, that's the other point. Debt, we know the link between debt and mental distress is well documented. And if you further suppress young people's living standards by forcing them to pay a certain amount for many, many years, that means they're less likely to settle down and have a family. The evidence in the United States is people wait longer and longer because of the cut to their living standards. It means obviously mortgages are more out of reach because they have less disposable income, which is, again, home ownership among the young generation is in a state of collapse in this country, down by about 35% for people under the age of 40. And it means, well, you know, if you talk about entrepreneurship, again, people are less likely to take risks if they have less disposable income as well. So it's a terrible impact, and we've seen it in the United States, and we've seen it here. I think we should fight for the principle that education is a social good, and I think we should fight against an injustice that says that younger people, some of whom weren't even born or won't have been born when the financial crash happened, are going to still end up paying for it for many, many years to come. The next generation is our future. The whole future of this country depends on it. And if we keep punishing young people in the way we're punishing them today, we're not just imperiling them, we're imperiling the entire future of this country as well.
Thank you. One more. I think we have time for one more brief question and brief comment, but let's take it from next door. Barley Room, any more questions? The clock is ticking.
Hi. You've talked very eloquently about passion to fight for the things that you care for. I don't know whether you're aware of how passionately the people of Farnham are fighting to overturn the dogma of Waverley Council. Is it not ironic that just at this time we've unveiled the statue of William Cobbett when the fight is really going, well, where is it going?
Do you have a question?
We're having to pay to fight.
What are Waverley Council doing exactly?
Maybe you're not aware of what the fight is.
There are a lot of local issues, but I think that is a very good spot to draw the evening to a close, because you will not You will.
But keep fighting, just quickly, keep fighting
keep
the
fighting.
great tradition of William Cobbett.
Yeah.
Keep fighting Waverley Council and overcome whatever they've done, which is bad. Okay?
Good answer. There we are. We must draw the proceedings to a close. I'm sure there are lots more questions, but we can't keep here all night. We can't keep Owen going all night. Two things to end with. One is, if you don't mind going in the room at the end after we finish, just to perhaps have a little chat. But since we are here representing the Mayor of the People's Republic of Farnham with us, I think we may be tempted to offer you a multi-entry visa. If you're willing to accept this honour. And I would like to ask our President, the President of the William Cobbett Society, to finish our proceedings for us.
Will be able to hear me in the Barley Room?
No, but they will if you put this on.
Thank you very much. Well, we've had a splendid evening and we have lots of thanks to give to various people. Sophie and her students, I understand, have put an enormous amount of work to help to get this evening, make it the success it's been. And we really do thank them. They worked virtually all day, I think. The Maltings have done us proud, I think, in providing us with 2 rooms at the same time and hosting us in this wonderful way. What we must thank, of course, are William Cobbett, who, rising from the grave, has spoken with an eloquence that we could only expect of him. But he has been matched and rivaled by our speaker tonight, our guest tonight, who has spoken with all the qualities that I think dear Mr. Cobbett would agree with and regard as necessary in this present world. He is forthright, he is opinionated, he is eloquent, he puts his views punctually and hard. Cobbett was always criticised, Mr. Cobbett, you will know, in your lifetime, for being savage and remorseless, a rhinoceros of a journalist, was one mention that was made of you. Well, I wouldn't quite call Owen a rhinoceros. He argues with fact and opinion, which is well backed up, as indeed Cobbett did. Cobbett was a great man of facts. It's often thought that he was just opinionated, but he always had facts at his fingertips. Owen, too, as I've learned this evening, also has facts at his fingertips and is prepared to back his very strong opinions with very powerful arguments from fact. And this is important. Byron said of Cobbett that he was like the tiger, that he would see his prey and then he would spring and seize it. But occasionally the prey would escape and then Cobbett would retreat into the undergrowth with a growl. Well, Owen, I hope you won't retreat growling to London or to Stockport tonight. You've savaged quite a few things, and you've enlightened us in many ways about not only your opinions, but about the world in which we live, and indeed the world in which Mr. Cobbett lived. We must thank you very much indeed for a splendid evening.
A big round of applause to the organisers who put this together. They've been absolutely fantastic, so please give them a big round of applause. And there, over here, over there.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's been an extremely stimulating evening. The meeting will now draw to a close, and if Owen doesn't mind spending a couple of minutes chatting to the group in there, fairness will be achieved to some small degree. But I really do appreciate you coming and giving us a splendid evening. Thank you very much.